Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. This is the 11th in the series of webinars for the capacity building program for the principal investigators who've applied to the GCF Grand Challenge Fund program of HEC, as well as other HEC researchers who may want to do this. This is being live streamed on Facebook as well as YouTube and EDU TV. So today we're going to talk about the experiences of doing Grand Challenge Fund type interventions from the UK. This is the fourth in the series of experiences of learning from other places. The first one was from the US. Then we did the Grand Challenge program in Canada. We also talked about the Pakistani experience through the TDF and the and the National Centers program day before yesterday. And today we're going to talk about UK, and the Gcrf program in the UK has been around for I think about a significant period of time, about 6 years, I think. And today we have two people who are who are joining us. Professor Nicola Lowe is is part of the UK Gcrf apparatus, and I think leads their nutrition program. Is that true? Agriculture nutrition. And then we have Dr. Jawwad Darr, who's the chairman of UpSign, which is an association in the UK that supports scientific collaboration with Pakistan through activating the UK Pakistani diaspora. Dr. Jawwad Darr is at UCL and has done a lot of research projects, and is going to talk about how do you set up large complex projects. So with that, I want to hand over to Professor Nicola Lowe, who's going to talk about the Gcrf experience, particularly focusing on things that we can learn in terms of doing GCF in Pakistan, but also the type of projects that seem to do well, seem to create more impact. So with that, over to you, Dr. Lowe.
Thank you very much, Atta, and thank you to the HEC for inviting me to speak with you today. It's a great privilege. I'm going to try and share my screen now so that you can see my presentation. Okay, so hopefully you can see what I'm seeing now. Great. Okay, so good evening, everybody joining us from Pakistan, or good morning or good afternoon if you're joining from elsewhere. I've been asked to talk about the key principles of what makes a successful grant proposal with the UK's Global Challenges Research Fund in mind. It's called, we shortened it to the Gcrf program. So I am a professor of nutrition at the University of Central Lancashire, but I'm also the challenge leader for the Gcrf program, specifically the food systems portfolio. And I'm going to be talking with from both perspectives, just both as an academic, as a researcher, but also as a challenge leader, and I'll explain what that means as we go along. So, okay, so this is what I aim to be talking about for about the next 30 to 40 minutes. I'm going to provide an overview of our Global Challenges Research Fund program, what it is, what it means. I'm sure there are a lot of parallels with your Global Challenges Fund in Pakistan. I'm going to talk about the key principles of a successful grant application to this fund, what makes it successful, what the principles are underlying this funding stream. Then I'm going to talk as an academic and reflect as a successful applicant, because I actually hold a Gcrf grant myself. It's a project based in Pakistan, so I hope will be of relevance and of interest to many of you. And it's called the Busy Fed Study. So that's going to be my case study that I'll share with you and show how the principles work in practice. And then when I'm done, I'm going to hand over to Jawwad, who's going to pick up from where I leave off. And I think we're going to have questions at the very end. So first of all, what is the Global Challenges Research Fund? UKRI, there on my slide, just stands for UK Research and Innovation. That's the umbrella organisation that is the mechanism by which nearly all research funding is organised here in the UK. And the Gcrf fund is just a very small part of the overall overall UKRI programme. So as I mentioned before, I'm a challenge leader for the Gcrf programme, which means that I'm involved in overseeing all the projects relating to food systems and nutrition. And I'll come back to that in a few moments. So where did the Gcrf programme come from? Well, as Attar mentioned, we've been up the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The research is designed to address the challenges that underpin these global goals. And it is part of the UK aid strategy, which has the remit of strengthening global and responses to crises, promoting global prosperity and tackling extreme poverty and helping the world's most vulnerable. So this is the UK aid strategy, and the Gcrf fund came out of this strategy document. The fund represents about £1.5 billion worth of UK taxpayers' money, and that large
It seems like Nicola has just, bumped off the call. Yes, yes, Nicola.
I'm sorry, I lost connection there. I shall.
Yes, you lost connection. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So apologies for that. So the key principles for the Gcrf programme. There are 5 key principles. I'm going to talk about 4 of them. So I'm not going to dwell on the first one because it's fairly self-explanatory. But the ones I am going to focus on are the following. Number 2, is the research challenge-led? Does the research have a real measurable impact in the low and middle income partner country? Are the partnerships equitable? And is the research truly interdisciplinary? And these are the key principles that the funding organisation looks at when they're evaluating a grant proposal. So first of all, what do I mean by challenge-led? These pictures on the left illustrate what we mean by discipline-led. It says, I'm a carpenter, pay me to make these different things. And that's not what we're looking for in a Gcrf grant. We're looking for this.
Nicola, we are not seeing your slides right now. Can you share slides again?
Okay. Okay, I'm hoping you can.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yes? Okay.
Yeah.
All righty. So what do we mean by challenge-led? On the left-hand side, we have discipline-led, and this is not what we're looking for. Here it says, I'm a carpenter, pay me to make these different things. What we are looking for is this on the right-hand side. It says, pay me to build a bridge. I will work with a carpenter, a designer, an engineer, a river expert. So this is challenge-led. We're looking at the challenge and then we're putting the team together to solve that particular challenge. The next criteria is, does the research have real measurable impact in the low or middle income partner country? And here we're referring back to the Sustainable Development Goals, which were developed by the UN to address those global challenges. So for a successful grant proposal through our Gcrf program, we have to be confident that the research is excellent and of very high scientific quality. It must be able to translate into measurable development impacts and must be scalable as well. So a project could be undertaken on a small scale in a particular community or in a particular region, but it has to be scalable. The impact needs to be scalable. So if it's successful in that community or in that region, there has to be evidence that that can then be scaled up on a national or even an international level for that grant to be successful. And we're also looking for research that leaves a legacy. It's not just about fund and go. It's about leaving behind a program that has a legacy well beyond the end of that initial funding period. In order to achieve this, it's often very useful to work with academic partners, of course, but also with NGOs and CSOs and government agencies and multinational bodies and others, in order that the development needs are clearly identified. By speaking with in-country NGOs, CSOs, they will often have a clear idea the development needs are from their perspective, rather than from the academic perspective. Quite often as academics, we design our research based on a theoretical framework or a technological framework or an idea that we think blue skies thinking. But for the Gcrf program, it really needs to be grounded in the needs of the community, of the environment, and to address that challenge. So blue skies thinking, blue skies research is fantastic because it is often groundbreaking, but it has to be really rooted in a practical, impactful outcome. The other point really to highlight here is this co-design element, and I'll come back to that in a little while when I talk about equitable partnerships and what that means. But seeking solutions, designing those solutions in a real world context, again, not from the academic or theoretical framework, but from the ground up. So really seeking the opinions of the local community, the local actors, those who are very much aware of the situation and what the real solutions might be. And the last point here is to ensure that that research, the evidence generated from that research, can be translated into policy. So I mentioned equitable partnerships. What does that really mean? Often we get the terms equality and equity confused, and I certainly have done in the past. But I think this picture here really illustrates the difference between the two. On the left, we have equality. Everybody's standing on the box that's at the same height. However, some are still unable to see the ball game. This is what we mean by equity. Those who don't need that leg up can manage without, don't have it. And those that do have the support they need to enable everybody to see the ball game or to participate in the research or whatever that might be. So I think this picture really just sums up the difference between equality and equity. And we are seeking equity in all the partnerships, which is not always easy to achieve, especially when there's money attached, funding streams attached, which often gives the power to the organisation that is holding the grant. But it's the responsibility of that organisation to ensure that there is equity in the partnerships, that everybody has access to the resources they need so that they can all participate fully. So this puts it in a slightly more formal way. For those partners to be equitable, the researchers need to work together to identify the research gaps and the needs. They need to work together to co-create those questions and what the research outcomes should be. They need to work together to test solutions to real-life problems. And they need to work together to build the capacity across all the organisations involved in the consortium. And I'm sure Jawwad will come on to this a little bit later on, to make sure that everybody has the skills, has that capacity developed to leave a lasting legacy, whether the researchers are in the UK or whether they're in Pakistan or wherever they are in the world. We all have the opportunity to learn from each other and to upskill together. So there are some challenges to working together in partnership. It's not easy. It's often very, very difficult. And this table just summarises on the left what those opportunities are, and on the right what those challenges are. So on the left, when working together, often it creates a very innovative environment. Different people, different ideas, different backgrounds, different cultures coming together is often a very fertile ground for innovation. However, on the right-hand side, those challenges of working with people with different priorities, different interests, different expectations and goals and schedules across different continents can be a major challenge. Again, on the plus side, sharing knowledge and expertise, bringing together groups with very, very different academic and research backgrounds is a great opportunity for capacity building. However, different capacities and different resources in different institutions in different parts of the world can provide barriers to that. Positives again, accessing resources to field sites and infrastructure is fantastic for me as a collaborator here based in the UK. It's fantastic for me to work with my colleagues in Pakistan who give me access to resources and field sites and infrastructure that I wouldn't have as an academic based in the UK. But the different processes that our organisations have and the different structures in place, particularly around the financial structures, the financial organisation, does create some real challenges when we're trying to manage our financial resources and make sure the money gets to the right place at the right time. Working with across those barriers is challenging, very challenging. Building capacity is a key benefit. Improved learning and practice across the board for all members of the team, and working together to have a greater impact as a team is certainly benefits. But managing those different legal and ethical frameworks, dealing with ethics Ethics boards in multiple countries, when you have a large consortium together, can be really difficult, because ethics committee will view things through different cultural lenses and through different ethical lenses, and how harmonizing those approaches is a real challenge, particularly with the different cultural lenses that we all have. So opportunities, definitely, but there are challenges too to working in partnership across different countries. But there are lots of tools out there to facilitate that process, and I've just listed a number of resources here. I hope this slide can be made available after the presentation so that people can pick up on these and use them. The one that I use most is this one down here. It's called the Global Code of Conduct, which is a very simple guide to how to set up an equitable partnership and what those principles are. So I would highly recommend that one. And I might mention that again a little bit later on. Oh yeah, this slide just illustrates that. There's a simple framework, 4 main pillars of fairness, respect, care, and honesty. And under each of those pillars are a number of articles that illustrate what that means in practice. So please do have a look at that if you're interested in knowing more about how to set up those partnerships in an equitable way. So back to the Gcrf. In the 5 years we've been in existence, we have funded over 1,000 grants. I think we're somewhere around 1,200 grants that we have awarded so far. The Gcrf was set up as a 5-year programme, and as I mentioned before, we had £1.5 billion in that pot to start with. We're coming to the end of that 5-year programme, and most of that money has now been spent. And the way we've spent it is illustrated here in these 4 boxes. We've funded a number of standalone research projects. We've also funded a number of networks and Network Plus grants. The Network Plus just means that it's a network with some additional money to fund small pilot projects that come out of that network. We've also funded a number of GROW awards. These are specifically for capacity building with a particular focus on early career researchers. And we've also funded 12 hubs, I believe. These have been our largest investment from the Gcrf programme, with budgets up to £20 million each. And these are very large, very substantial consortia of researchers from a number of different countries working together to address a particular challenge or series of challenges. And those have been our largest investment from the programme. But these 1,000+ grant awards have been retrospectively organised into 6 different portfolios that are listed here on the right-hand side of the slide. Resilience, conflict, cities, food systems, education, and health. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I oversee the food systems portfolio. So out of these 1,000 grants, we have somewhere between 200 to 300 projects that fall within my portfolio. Clearly, there's overlap across all 6 portfolios, because oftentimes a project that is related to food systems will also have elements of climate change in there as well. So, for example, the breeding of crops to build in resistance to climate change would fall into both of those portfolios. So there is some overlap between them, but this is how we've organised those 1,000 projects. And the reason that we've put them into these portfolios is so that we can, rather than just fund the research and walk away, what we want to do is to enable the principal investigators to form a cohort, to be able to synergize with each other, to share their results with each other, and for us to gain additional impact from the investment in that research. So it's a way of creating synergy between these 1,000 projects and to maximize the impact of that investment in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. This slide just shows who the other challenge leaders are. This is me here. I work alongside my colleague Tarat Shahid. Together we oversee the food systems portfolio, but each of the portfolios has a challenge manager, a challenge leader, and a challenge manager. And who we are, if you Google Gcrf program, you'll be able to find out who each of us is and what our particular expertise is. So I'd like to move on now into the second part and talk a little bit about my reflections as a researcher, as a Gcrf grant holder myself, and share with you perhaps some of the challenges and some top tips really for how I have overcome some of the challenges that I've already mentioned, and how I've addressed those key principles of the Gcrf program in practice. So this part of my talk is under 6 headings listed here. So I'm going to start with developing the idea, moving on to creating the team, talk what we mean by interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and transdisciplinary. Some top tips about filling in the form, because I'm sure your Global Challenges Fund, I'm guessing you have a big form to fill in when you're applying for funding, as we do here in the UK, and that can be quite daunting at times, particularly if you're doing it for the first time. And what my top tips are, and then I'm going to talk about my own research as a case study to illustrate some of those points. So the first point here is developing your idea. And I think, you know, it is quite obvious to state really that scientific rigor must be at the very heart of the proposal that you're suggesting. What the reviewers will look at is the design. It will go out to an expert review team who will have a very, very close scrutiny of the design to make sure that the design enables the hypothesis to be tested effectively, and that it's feasible within the time frame of the grant award or the project that you're proposing. They will also look very closely at the team and the track record, and this is one that is a bit of a catch-22. If you know, it's very hard, particularly for early career researchers, to demonstrate a track record, and yet you can't get the funding unless you do. So you kind of go around in this circle. But if you are an early career researcher, then fitting in with a team that includes an experienced professor, or if you're an experienced professor and you're putting together a proposal, then think about including some early career researchers as co-Is to give them that opportunity to develop their own track record, because that's really critical. The reviewers will also look at the facilities that you need to deliver your project, whether it be in your own country or elsewhere, to make sure that that infrastructure is in place. And really, all the funder is trying to do is to minimize their own risk of the project not delivering on the impact. I think, you know, working now within the UKRI system, I can see that from the funder's perspective, they want to see these projects succeed, and they want to minimize their risk of it not succeeding. And that's what this review process is all about. Creating the team, I've touched on this already. It's important to choose wisely. Often there are pressures to include people in your team, but I would say choose very wisely. There aren't the resources to have passengers in the team, so everybody on that team needs to have a specific role. And again, that's something that reviewers will look at. They'll see the list of names and they'll want to know exactly what their role is on the project, and that needs to be very clear and very transparent. It may involve overseas partners, certainly does for the Gcrf program. It's important to identify groups that share a common interest, and you can identify these international partners by looking at the literature, or you can use networking events such as conferences to introduce yourself to potential interested groups that share share an academic research area that's similar to your own, and build a network there so that when the grant funding opportunity arises, you have some key contacts, you have that stack of business cards of people that you can pick up and contact and say, hey, are you interested in collaborating with me on this? But I would point out that it does take time to build trust and time to build relationships. Oftentimes, there is the window of time between the grant call going out and the deadline for submitting the application can be very, very short, and not enough time to start with a brand new collaboration or a brand new relationship. So I would say start right away, even before the call is announced. Start making those connections, using those networking opportunities, having those conversations, so that when the call is announced, you're in a good position to hit the ground running and to get your proposal in on time, and give relationships time to develop and for that trust to build. So this little bit is all about what's the difference between multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. It's difficult to know what the difference is between those, and within the Gcrf program, we are looking for interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. But what does that actually mean? So I think this next series of slides will help to illustrate that. So this is what we mean by multidisciplinary. It's a bowl of fruit. The fruit are all sitting there next to each other. They look absolutely beautiful, and they are all beautiful in their own right, but they're sitting next to each other. There's no shared flavor. They're just individuals, all happen to be sitting in the same dish. And that's what we mean by multidisciplinary. And that's not what we want within the Gcrf program, although it is very beautiful. It's not what we want. This is closer to what we want. This is interdisciplinary. Here, the partners, or the fruits in our example, have been chopped up and mixed up into a fruit salad so that you have that mix of disciplines. There's an opportunity for those flavors to mix and share their outputs, is what we're meaning in terms of the grant application process. So there's a bit more mixing there than the separate bowl of fruit. But this is really something different. This is what we mean by transdisciplinary. Here we have a fruit smoothie. So that fruit salad has been taken, it's been put in a blender, and it's all been mixed up together to create something that is completely new. It has a different texture, it has a different flavor, it has a unique quality. And that's what we mean by transdisciplinary. And that's spelled out in this slide here. And I'm just going to read these words. It says, research efforts conducted by investigators from different disciplines working jointly to create new conceptual, theoretical, methodological, and translational innovations that integrate and move beyond the discipline-specific approach to address a common problem. So it's something that goes beyond our subject disciplines, that creates something completely new. The flavors in our example of the smoothie create a highly sought after product that is much, much more than the sum of the parts. So I hope my food related example helps to illustrate what the difference is between multi, inter and transdisciplinary research. And really transdisciplinary is what we're all looking for. Just a few words about filling in those daunting forms. When I sit down to write my grant proposal, I've already got my idea in mind, I've got my team in mind. I'm hoping it's a transdisciplinary team that can create something really new together. But those forms are quite daunting. And the first thing I do is sit down, have a look at the whole form from beginning to end, just so that I know what piece of information needs to go where. And I don't start putting the wrong things in the wrong place or duplicating. Often those boxes that we need to fill in seem to want the same information, but put in a slightly different way. So best strategy is to sit down, look at the application form from beginning to end, so you have an overview, a map in your own mind of what needs to go where. Another top tip really is that the word count is crucial. Certainly on the Gcrf forms, they don't allow you to go over the word count. The electronic system prevents you from doing that. So every word is precious. Putting together the budget is one of the most difficult parts of the grant application process. And we're very fortunate in my own institution in that we have a fantastic finance team that will help us do that. So if you have a finance team at your own institution, take advantage of them, find a friendly face and get somebody there to help you put that together, because that is quite challenging if you're not a financial expert yourself. There are lots of rules. Every funder will have their own rules, whether that be around what overheads you can charge, what the equipment maximum is, what you can put against your staffing budget. Make sure you're really familiar with those rules so that you don't get eliminated from the process in the early stages for breaking those rules. And one thing I found is around the signatures needed. These applications often need signatures from all parts of the institution. And the last thing you want to do is to be ready to submit your proposal a couple of days ahead of the deadline, only to find that your Vice Chancellor is out of the country. So make sure that you get those signatures lined up well in advance so that you don't run the risk of missing the deadline. So just to summarize my top tips then for writing a successful grant application. First one really is time. There's never enough. When you see that call come out and you make the decision to submit a proposal to that call, clear your diary as much as you possibly can and give yourself the best chance of having a clear window to focus on your proposal. If you have a lot of partners involved in your proposal, then make sure that they're all kept informed. Best way to do that is just prepare a timeline so that everybody knows what the plan is, and stick to the timeline and keep everybody in the loop, and delegate sections to various partners to help contribute to the overall workload. Make sure that you have plenty of time for those signatures. Set up a database of alerts or schedule a time in your diary, maybe once per month, to look for opportunities so that you stand the best chance of seeing the opportunity as soon as that call is launched and not a week before the deadlines. If you check, have a schedule, make sure you do that on a regular basis. Give yourself the best possible chance of having as much time as possible to complete your application. And yeah, as I mentioned before, don't wait for the call to start preparing. Do some horizon scanning, start developing your relationships, keep an eye on the literature to see what's new and where the gaps are, so that again, when that opportunity arises to put in your application, you're already ready, you've already done some of that legwork. So that's my top tips. I hope that was useful. And I'd just like to end now by spending just a few minutes telling you about the study that we're conducting in Pakistan with my colleagues in Pakistan. And this hopefully gives an example of what a successful grant application looks like. So the project is all about biofortification of wheat with zinc in Pakistan. We shorten that to BusyFed. That's the acronym we use for the project. And just to remind you of the key principles, is it challenge-led? Does it have measurable impact? Are the partnerships equitable? And is the research truly interdisciplinary? I'd like you to hold those in your mind as I describe this project to you and see how well we map against those key principles. So first of all, the challenge. What is the challenge that we're addressing? Well, the challenge is all about hidden hunger. Hidden hunger is a term that's used to describe multiple micronutrient deficiencies, so deficiencies in vitamins, in minerals, which affect the growth and development of children, leading to poor health in adulthood as well. one way to describe hidden hunger that was coined by the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF is this, and I'm going to use his words because I think this really describes hidden hunger very well. He says, "You might not feel it in the belly, but it strikes at the core of your health and vitality. It remains widespread, posing devastating threats to health, education, economic growth, and to human dignity in developing countries." So this is the challenge that our project was aimed to address, specifically looking at zinc deficiency. So what is the impact of our research? Well, we know that zinc deficiency affects 17% of the world's population, and it's higher in low and middle income countries. We also know that iron deficiency is the most common nutrient deficiency worldwide, affecting 21% of pregnant women, 15% of non-pregnant women, and 23% of preschool children. So both of these nutrient deficiencies do have a global impact. And what are the consequences of these nutrient deficiencies? Well, in children, they lead to stunted growth, impaired cognitive and motor development. In women of childbearing age, it increases the complications during pregnancy and causes a reduction of the growth of the fetus in utero. And in adults, it can lead to increased morbidity due to an impaired immune function. So picking up infections much more readily, which can lead to economic consequences in terms of more time out of work. So it ticks a number of the Sustainable Development Goals and has an economic impact both at the individual level, at the community level, at the regional and at the national level. So multiple ways by which these deficiencies can exhibit their consequences. But what are the solutions? Well, to reduce micronutrient deficiencies, we can provide supplements. We can fortify food using micronutrient powders that can be added to food, such as flour or rice or salt, or that can be sprinkled onto food just before it is served. But these strategies are difficult to implement, particularly in rural, remote communities where access to supplements and the monitoring of fortification programs can be really challenging. And they're very difficult to sustain because they are expensive to sustain. The reason fortification, particularly in Pakistan, is not a sustainable solution is because it requires those nutrients to be added to the flour at the milling stage. So when the grain is milled, the fortificant is added to the flour and then it is embedded in the product that is then sold. But we know that over 60% of Pakistan's wheat harvest is retained by the farmers for self-consumption. And they don't take the grain to a large central mill where the fortificant can be added. They take it to a local mill where the fortificant may not be available or certainly cannot be closely monitored to ensure that the right amount is added. So most of the wheat is ground locally, not in the large industrial mills, and so fortification is really not a realistic strategy. However, biofortification is the solution that we are hoping to generate evidence to show whether or not this could be a useful strategy. And the difference between this and fortification is that we're increasing the mineral and vitamin content of the food through a breeding strategy and through agronomic techniques. It's not genetically modified, it's a standard breeding process, so that the wheat itself contains higher levels of micronutrients naturally without needing to add anything at any other stage during the process. Once the wheat is grown, it can be milled as usual and the flour is naturally enriched in micronutrients. It's cost effective. The seed can be replicated by the farmer year on year. It doesn't require any particular dietary changes and the whole population benefits. So it has the potential to be cost effective and sustainable. But in order to have the impact that we want this to have, we need to be able to scale this up. We need to generate the evidence that it does improve health outcomes. We have to demonstrate that it's acceptable to both producers, to farmers, and also to consumers, that they like it, they want it. The producers, the farmers feel that it's a good crop, that it's a resilient crop, and it gives a good yield. And we have to liaise with policymakers so that the evidence that we generate is available to policymakers so that they can make a decision whether or not to scale up on a national level. So that really describes the aim of the project, the impact that we hope to have from the research. And this slide just shows the scale of the problem. These data come from the national surveys undertaken in Pakistan between 2001 and 2018, showing really these are the data for zinc deficiency, the prevalence of zinc deficiency. It has been decreasing over the years, both in women and in children, but we're still at levels around 20% in both age groups, which so still a significant problem. And similarly with iron. 2011, 2018, the prevalence of iron deficiency anemia in women hasn't really changed, and in children as well has changed very little. So we still have a real challenge there that needs to be addressed. And this slide shows the level of stunting across Pakistan. Stunting is another measure of nutritional deficiency. And you can see from this portion on the bottom right-hand corner of the slide that the stunting rates have changed very, very little since 1965 to the present time. So there is a major challenge there that we hope biofortification may be able to address. So the study is located up in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, up in the northwest. And just a few pictures to show the environment. On the brick kilns just outside of Peshawar, where our community is based. One main principle that I mentioned earlier is, are the partnerships equitable? And this is something we take very seriously in our research to make sure that all of our partners, and our partners include the community members, include the researchers, include the policymakers, that everybody is treated with equity. This slide just illustrates the large number of partners involved in the project, both from the UK and from Pakistan, academic partners, as well as NGO partners in the form of the Abyssine Foundation, which is a local NGO that we work very closely with. And this is the research team that's involved in the project. And in terms of equitable partnerships, to involve the community in the study design in order to ensure that the research design meets the needs of the community and addresses the challenges that they face. We have regular meetings with the elders of the community, or the Gcrf, to consult them on the study design and receive their input, because it's really important that the research that we do is culturally appropriate, is acceptable to the community, and that it does meet the challenges that they have. So we talk with the Gcrf, we talk with the community members through structured interviews, talking to participants that are involved in our randomized controlled trials, and we make sure that we talk to both men and to women. We ask them about their experiences, their preferences, their perceptions around the use of biofortified flour, and we analyze and ensure that that's embedded in the study design. We also talk to the farmers. There's no point in producing a wheat that's high in zinc, but has a very poor yield, and the farmers don't want to grow because it's not economically viable. So we speak with members of the farming community from different regions in Pakistan, those who have grown the biofortified wheat in the past and those who haven't, to ascertain what their awareness of the concept of biofortification is, what their experiences are if they have grown the crop before and how satisfied they were with it. And again, that's all brought into the analysis process. So coming to the end now, is our research truly interdisciplinary? Have we created a smoothie, or are we still sitting there as separate fruits in our fruit bowl? Well, to illustrate the answer to this point, I just want to put up the objectives of our research, just to illustrate the fact that we do have a very broad interdisciplinary team that I hope as the project goes on, and it's still a very active project at the moment, will prove that we have developed into a transdisciplinary team. So our first objective is around nutrition. So we have nutritionists on the team to design and undertake those intervention studies for generating the evidence of the impact of consuming the biofortified flour on nutrition and health. We have agronomists on the team. We work closely with Fauji Fertilizer Company and colleagues at NARC, as well as agronomists here in the UK, working together to see how well the wheat performs under different field conditions. We have social scientists on board as well, who help us to understand the cultural context, the traditions, the knowledge. And here we are working with colleagues from Khyber Medical University, who will help us to interpret the attitudes of stakeholders on what they think about biofortification, and whether or not, if this was scaled up on a national level, whether it would be acceptable. And we're also working with academic teams at the university and at Khyber Medical University to help develop and build capacity, both on the Pakistan side and also on the UK side. I have a team of early career researchers who are being trained to work in research that addresses the Sustainable Development Goals. So that capacity building works on both sides, with our Pakistani colleagues and also with our own colleagues in the UK, to build up the next generation of scientists with a heart for working in the Sustainable Development Goals arena for development research. And that's really important to us. So we are, as I mentioned, the work is ongoing. We completed a foundation study that was funded through the Gcrf program, and we're now extending that further into a larger program, which will be completed next year. So just reviewing our key principles and giving you the opportunity to think about how well we did in meeting those principles. I hope I've demonstrated that our research is challenge-led. The challenge of hidden hunger is the core of our research and what we're trying to achieve. Does it have a real and measurable impact in the partner country? I hope I've demonstrated that in Pakistan, iron and zinc deficiencies are still a problem, and this research may lead to a sustainable solution that can help to have an impact on that challenge. Are the partnerships equitable? This is something that we are continually working on to make sure that all voices are heard, the voices of the academics, the voices of the policymakers, the voices of the community members, all our partners in the research, and we work very hard to ensure that all voices are heard at every stage of the process. We don't always get it right, but it's something we're very aware of and try very hard to make sure that happens. And is the research truly interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary? Well, we've brought together some experts in all different aspects relating to our study, relating to our research question. So I hope that in time, that interdisciplinary team will produce something that's truly transdisciplinary. So I think that's all I wanted to say. I hope that made some sense, and I know there will be an opportunity for questions a little later on, But in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to Jawwad, who's going to pick up on some of the aspects of what we've been talking about today.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Professor Jawwad Darr. I'm going to talk to you about practical considerations in forming research consortia. So this is a personal perspective from me. I'm going to talk about typical structure of consortia, particularly large consortia. I've been involved in about, well, currently £20 million worth, which is about 4 billion rupees worth of large projects total value that are currently running. I've had a lot of experience in looking at different structures of consortia, what works well, particularly around structures, communication between those structures. We're also going to talk about some aspects around diversity, something about training. Many of these grants have an international element. I think it's very important that PIs think about how they're going to look at those things. We're going to cover things like management, how often you should have meetings, managing risk. Also going to look at particularly advisory boards and how you could get best benefit from them. And also thinking about how you break down the big challenges that you're trying to solve with these global challenges, and maybe think about breaking them into smaller or larger objectives. We're going to talk about risk registers. I'm sure many of you have experience of that. For those of you who don't, we just think about how often you should be looking at these aspects, and then talk about how you can maybe network, increase impact, and maybe be more inclusive if you're lucky enough to get this funding. This is a rather complicated looking diagram, but I think the key thing I want to highlight here, and I'll show this diagram a few times, is that generally you have some kind of management team. Often that is the PI, a project leader. Now I often recommend that within this team you would obviously have work package leaders, possibly site leads if you've got up to 4 or 5 different sites, and probably some kind of coordinator, staff member, who are admin, and these are the key people doing a lot of the coordination, of course. Now, one of the things that I think is very useful, has worked very well in the UK. Often you would have a very senior in this core management. You have a senior PI who is the named investigator and probably has a strong reputation, strong track record. But what you might think about is a project leader, so somebody who is maybe more early career, male or female, who would benefit from actually being a project leader. By that, they would actually take most of the day-to-day and week-to-week responsibilities, with the PI being more in a sort of supervisory role to look over that person, and obviously talk to them on a daily basis, or certainly every few days, to make sure that they are providing that sort of steering for the project leader. So this is a great opportunity for someone who is probably doesn't have to be a very, very senior person, but should be quite experienced. So think about this role of PL. The other thing you can see is I've divided this into work packages, work package 1 going down. And so the important thing is to have two-way communication between the core management team and the work package leads and the teams that sit below them, the senior researchers or PhD studentships or other team members. And of course, some of the work that you'll do in Global Challenges will cut across several work packages. So there should be communication going sideways as well between the work packages. So this is a typical sort of consortium, and the important thing is within these structures that you have some kind of general agreement that these teams will meet in sub-teams, and these eventually will meet in larger teams depending on the frequency. So for example, you might have usually quarterly, or whatever, sort of typically quarterly face-to-face meetings, or in these days of COVID, you may decide that these are going to be online. But certainly these quarterly or other meetings would be in such a way that they would be, so 3 or 4 month meetings would be allowing the whole team to get together and to talk through the sort of results that people are getting and get feedback from everyone. But maybe more frequently, for example, the core management team, they may meet every 2 weeks and particularly look at things like risk registers. Now, the other sort of feed-in could be from an advisory or academic board, and you could decide you could have both or one or of the other. These would typically be feeding in maybe say every 6 months, and of course this would include some feed-in from the core management team where they would largely interact with, And this would be to give an overview of what's going on and get some feedback really, and sort of keep that going on a regular basis throughout the project. And this could be particularly useful when you're trying to bring in some translation work where the industry consortium or partners might be able to give you some suggestions and advice. And of course, also, if you have a project that has a lot of IP around it, you may think about having regular business development meetings. This is meeting with the commercialization arms of the university, so business development, technology transfer managers and people like that. On the outside of your project, which is defined by this red dotted line, you might think about how you're going to work with other industry or other academic partners, and this is something we'll come to in a minute. So really, how often should you be meeting? Well, that's up to you. But as I said, it's important to have leaders within the project at different levels, and certainly look at how often, for example, the work packages might get together, maybe on a monthly basis, for example, for example, research teams may weekly, just to talk about practical aspects of day-to-day running of facilities or project matters. So really, it should be set out from the beginning how these little teams are going to interact. One of the things looking particularly international is how you look at diversity and handle that. And I've listed some different types of diversity that might be relevant here. I'm not going to go into all of these because some of these are a little bit sensitive, but in particular, I really want us to focus on gender and age, which I think are two areas which are clearly Pakistan. There are issues in Pakistan and things are getting better, but it is really important that you find capable female researchers and academics or scientists for these projects. They are out there. It's a matter of finding people who are suitable, and I think that in this day and age, a grant application with all men in all the senior positions, where there are plenty of capable women in most of these topics, is just not acceptable. And I don't think the reviewers who are looking at your grants would take care kindly on that. So really, also think about age. And I think these sort of grants are great because early career people who have a lot of energy and really want to prove themselves, we should really be making sure that we highlight the fact that we are giving opportunities, and also that there are career development opportunities for both, say, women, particularly to take up leadership roles, and people at early careers to also feel like they've got an opportunity to be involved in the management, for example, or get experience of management without risking the project. And so I think that's an important part of how you should be describing what you intend to do around some of the issues around diversity. And there may be some of these other ones that you feel are relevant to Pakistan or science, where people being underrepresented, and I think if possible do mention them in your proposal. I think training is incredibly important here, and often these large projects are really focusing about the task and not thinking about continuing development. I think at the very least, given a lot of things I've heard about what happens in Pakistan, I think that the training around sexual harassment and bullying is probably a little bit behind some of the other countries, say in the West, where this is kind of compulsory now within universities. And I know it hasn't yet come in to be compulsory in all universities, but I would strongly advise you, the ones in red in particular, I strongly advise you to offer training around diversity, sexual harassment, bullying. And I think other things that I think are really important are critical thinking, and really getting your teams at all levels to be involved in training around that. I think they would find it very useful, and it would improve the way they work together. Leadership training for those people who it would be relevant to. It may not be relevant to everybody at this stage, but certainly people certainly who aspire to be leaders or senior leaders, they should be encouraged to do this sort of training. Those of you who are supervising researchers, master's students, PhDs, you should certainly undergo training on how to supervise a research student. And you may have a PhD yourself, but you may not necessarily be qualified to supervise others because it's not automatic. And I know HEC is doing something around this area anyway. But you know, if you have that in-house or you can get access to it until that comes around, you may think about that. Other training that I strongly recommend is more around expanding your network, particularly with industry. So what are the tricks to interacting with industry and becoming an effective networker? These are skills that most academics, even in the UK, are not very good with. And you know, if you can get some skills training around that, I think the academics would really benefit in areas, in projects where there's particularly a lot of commercial interest or products, for example, which won't be in all cases, but in some cases they will. And of course, you should provide training around GDPR, data protection, and sort of making sure that you're compliant, because you may be working with international partners who take that extremely seriously. So going back to the Industry Advisory Board, what is the Industry Advisory Board? What does it do and what's it there for? Well, the first thing to say is if you want to get industry members on board of your project, you should think about your letters of support. And really the letters of support, not everybody would admit this, but most people tend to draft the first version themselves, because often industry, particularly in some countries, are not very familiar with writing these letters of support. And I think the key thing that I would recommend is that you send a summary of your proposal to your industry collaborators and set up a discussion with them to go through it and about what you want from them and what you expect. Then you should help them by drafting a letter of support if they're happy to do that. Generally, the letter of support, standard way, would be that it would include some information about the company, what they're about, what your discussions have been about, and why they are interested in the project. And then finally, how they can help the project and bring the project forward, as well as sitting on your advisory board, industry advisory board. What else could they offer? So in terms of people's time, access to facilities, or other things that you can't access in the universities. And they should allocate an in-kind or cash value to that. So typically if it's just access to facilities or people's time, it's an in-kind support at a reasonable rate that would be applicable to Pakistan. If you have industry advisory boards, then the membership should be made up of as gender balanced as you can get it. It should be reasonably diverse. You would need them to sign confidentiality and be aware of their requirements for confidentiality. And you need to decide what the purpose for you is. Is the purpose of your advisory board, is the purpose that you would actually act upon their advice or just seek their advice? I think you should make it really clear, because often if they're not listened to, they may feel undervalued. And of course, you've got to decide how often you want to interact with the advisory board. And it's really important to sort of effectively give them a heads of terms, what their purpose is, how they're helping you, so that everybody's clear from the outset. So I just want to now talk about sprints and marathons. So when you have various work packages going on in your structure, however you set it out, what would be nice is to look and track particular projects which are maybe short-term and long-term. So here you can see on this diagram I've put the junior research teams of these sort of PhDs and master students potentially. These are meeting on according to this diagram, and these are to track what's called sprints. And also every 2 weeks, maybe a slightly expanded team is going to also look at sprints. Now, what are sprints and marathons is the question. So a sprint is really something which has a very defined short time period, which is heading towards a specific goal. And typically this would be of the order of 4 to 8 months. It could be very beneficial to be able to get a team of people, and this might be across several work packages, to come together to really push towards achieving something at the end of this sprint. I mean, it is a milestone, but it's a very short term and it's a sort of a pressured milestone. The reason for that is often academics in large projects, they work in silos. They don't talk to each other. They work on their own and they have no really short-term objectives. And so they don't tend to work in teams with people outside of their immediate location. And that's the danger. So by having a sprint, which is across different academic sites and different groups, you've got a way of focusing around a particular short-term target. Of course, you can also have marathons or things which are longer term, and these may be first year milestones, second year milestones, which are sort of longer term. Okay, on to talking about risk registers. So clearly in a project, you want to minimize risk. And one of the things I'm suggesting is that on a 2-weekly basis, if you have a core group, that you pay close attention to your risk register. Of course, at the beginning, you should brainstorm, but the idea is to update and remove things as you achieve a successful outcome and those risks are removed or mitigated. So essentially, we have a risk register here. This is the side of the project. Typically, you would talk about the cause of any risk, what the likelihood of that risk is, whether it's low, medium, or high, and what the impact would be. So what would be the influence if something was to go wrong? Would it have a very big effect on the whole project? And if it does, then it would be classed as high. So we're using a traffic light system here, essentially, with red being high and low being the green, which is less impactful or less risk. And of course, you should have some mitigations. And obviously, it's important that all of the partners in the consortium are aware of risk registers. And indeed, these could be done both at the managerial level, but of course, they could also be done at the work package level as well. So I would recommend you do both and obviously collate them for the management team. And I think it's really important to have ownership over the risk. Who is in charge of monitoring the risk and mitigating the risks? And do they have trigger dates by which, if they don't solve those problems or those risks still are quite high and have a large impact, you may decide that remediation needs to happen by a certain point, because you can't carry those risks indefinitely till the end of the project, because they essentially could be very damaging for the overall outcome of the project or success. Okay, so networking and outreach. I think it's important that if you are lucky enough to be awarded one of these very large grants in a consortium of several universities, one of the things I want to highlight in red is you should think about benevolence. Benevolence being, there'll be many people who work in this field who haven't been involved in your project and weren't selected, and they're probably a little bit upset by that. But actually, with such a large project and large funding, you have the chance to think about whether there's a network that you could form that from time to time, say once a year or more often than that, you could use that as a way to communicate with the rest of the community in Pakistan or even wider about what is going on in the project once you've sorted out any confidentiality issues, and to sort of offer opportunities for co-creation. So can you create new areas that the project could, without losing its focus, but there may be new collaboration you could bring in. And if they don't have a cost, there's no incurring of any cost, there may be people have students who want to work in this field with your consortium, and as long as you have a sensible agreement of how that's going to work and you look at the confidentiality issues, you should offer opportunities for others to collaborate if possible. So think about how you're going to disseminate that information as well. You could use these networking events maybe once a year or so as that. Maybe you could have some flexible funding if you're allowed to have that, where you could offer some bursaries for collaboration as well. This is what happens typically on large projects in the UK. It's very common. And of course, by networking with industry or other organizations, you've got a chance to get other perspectives in terms of what you're doing, and fresh pairs of eyes who aren't inside of the project but looking from an external point of view. And I think it also allows you to, if you have an event where you're talking to the public, it allows you to also think about how you outline where you are in the project, how your key performance indicators, KPIs, are doing. And it sort of just tells people how well the project is going and what your areas are, if there's any stumbling blocks, and maybe you can get expertise from others. So in conclusion, I think it's really important to have a really solid structure for your team. You're working across many universities with people at different stages of their academic careers, from very early career to middle to senior career. Within that, you should have very clear lines of communication through your work packages, but have the ability to work across different work packages. Make sure you regularly get input from all of the community, including industrial stakeholders or academic stakeholders, once you've got confidentiality in place. Most importantly of all, make sure that within your project of several universities that you create an academic culture And this means that you give training to everybody to make sure that they all understand that it's very important the way they behave, the way they are in terms of looking at gender equality and not being ageist in terms of where the responsibilities and in the project lie. So, you know, this is a great opportunity to bring in people who ordinarily wouldn't necessarily get the ability to run projects, certainly at some level. Think about protocols where you have a large group of people working in slightly different ways. Maybe you can bring in some common ways of doing things. For example, if you have a project on battery manufacturing, testing, or agriculture, you might think about sharing how some of that testing or other protocols for, say, battery testing, it should be done exactly the same, because actually very small differences in protocols can give you very different results. And so this would be an important thing to think about. I think make sure you're on top of the risk register and that you are doing this on a very often, at least twice a month. And, you know, really just think about how you can interact with the community. Once you get this funding, you just don't want to be in a silo, which is just either within your own university or even within your consortium. You want to find ways to sharing some of the learning with the community, offering them training or other things that could be beneficial to the community, because you want this project to have much bigger impact beyond your initial small team of researchers. So importantly, work to international standards in terms of standards of behavior and expectations. That's really important. And often Pakistan has not had the luxury of being able to work on large international projects all the time, certainly not recently. And most of all, try and make your project fun and inclusive, so that people feel empowered to really make decisions and also to develop new ideas, which are multidisciplinary in the way that was described by Nicola Lowe. So thank you and good luck, and happy to answer any questions.
To the questions. So we go with the first question. What practical value comes out of putting a transdisciplinary team?
Practical value?
Yes.
Well, a lot of the I mean, the GCRF program, and I'm sure it's the same for your grand challenges, it is challenge focused. It's focused around the Sustainable Development Goals and finding solutions. And those solutions and those challenges are complex, and they require more than one subject discipline to solve them. Often it requires maybe a basic science approach coupled with a social science approach to understand the context into which the solution is being placed. So by having an interdisciplinary team or a multidisciplinary team, it brings different perspectives to finding a workable solution, not just a one-dimensional solution.
And a follow-up question to that is, who does implementation on ground? And does the researcher do it herself or himself? Or does she or he get other kinds of people to implement it for them?
Yeah, I think this is the situation. Implementation on the ground is the key. It is so important. And certainly in my case, it's not possible for me to do that because, number one, I'm located in the UK. And number two, if I tried to implement on the ground, I know for a fact I would not be successful because I don't speak the language. So it's really important to find an implementation partner if you're not able to do it yourself. So that's what I mentioned in my presentation about pairing with an NGO or a CSO, an organization that already has close links with the community that you're planning to work with to address the challenge, and to have that high level of trust already there with your target community. It's not impossible for academics to already have that. Certainly a lot of my colleagues at Khyber Medical University would have that ability to be the implementer themselves. But from my perspective, we work through an NGO as our implementation partner because they know the community, they have trust with the community, and they understand the community perspective a lot better than I could.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Nicola. Professor Jawwad, I think the second question, perhaps you could help us respond to this. How do you demonstrate a track record if you haven't done a Gcrf style big project before?
I think Nicola might have actually already answered that if I saw the chat just now.
Started to type, but I ran out of time.
Yeah, Nicola, I think you should answer that because you've already answered it on the chat. So why don't you?
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a difficult one. It is a catch-22, as I mentioned before, that you know, you need to have the track record to get the funding, and yet you need the funding to get the track record. I think one way that we managed to get to develop a track record is to do a few small pilot projects with your team. Get your team together, perhaps just a few small pilot projects just to show a number of things. Number one, that you can work with each other, that the relationship is there, and number two, that you can deliver some reasonable outcomes. It might not, I mean, the pilot project that you undertake, you might not have any external funding for. You might have to use internal funding streams from your own institution, or you may have to just do it on a shoestring with very little money at all. But you can do it. You don't need the big amounts of money to do something really useful if you can put your own time and energy into it. So whatever you can do to show that you can do some meaningful research, that your team can work together as a group, and that perhaps you can get that out as an abstract at a meeting or as a short communication somewhere, just to show and start to build that track record. That's the approach that we took, and I think that is a useful way forward.
Nicola, I echo a lot of what you said. What I would add to that is, in my very many journeys to Pakistan, I realized that there's a resource here, and we use this in the UK, is our master students, okay? Master students, and of course, these are obviously, it's a very time limited amount of time, and the scope of what they can do and the cost of what they can do is quite small. But I often thought there was a missed opportunity there. When I look at many of the ones who are looking at associated with these ORICs, there's all these little masters projects going on. But actually, when they're asked to do something commercialized, they often just, their answer is to develop an app. Well, I think they could be doing a lot more than just developing apps. There's great opportunities for them to go out and talk to industry, you know, start doing some of that market research that you need as part of their, you know, investigations. So I actually, when I want to get into an area like batteries, I actually use master's projects. And often if you have a small amount of funding in something else, you often have your researchers spend a little bit of their time working in something else that's priming to give you that track record. So I think I agree, you've got to be done on a shoestring. Use those free or low cost resources within your university, the manpower resource of things like masters.
Thank you, Nicola and Professor Jawwad. Another follow-up question on Gcrf. We understand focus is on research goals, but how has the experience been for actually translating the impact on society?
That's a
Perhaps
really,
Nicola? Yeah,
that's a really good question. And one that I think us as researchers and academics really struggle with. How do we translate our research into policy, into practice? And I think number one, make sure that the research you undertake addresses a question that policymakers need answers to. Policymakers aren't necessarily interested in our academic aspiration. They want answers to challenges. So in the early days of designing the research, speak to the policymakers, see what angle they're coming from, see what their questions are, and make sure that your research can address those questions. It doesn't have to be only about policy, but if you can angle or create an angle within your research program that will speak the language of the policymakers, speak to the questions they need answering, then you stand a much better chance of conveying your results into a language that the policymaker understands and wants to hear. I think sometimes we forget that policymakers are not necessarily scientists, or may come from a very different scientific background to our own, or even a different academic background to our own. So we have to make sure that the results that we produce from our research is written in a language that policymakers can understand and can convey to their department. So we've worked really hard at writing policy briefings. It's a very different style to the academic style. It requires a very different kind of a language and a different kind of presentation. That has to be short. Policy briefings can't be more than a few pages long, because policymakers just don't have time to read scientific documents. So yeah, it's about designing the research to address the questions that policymakers have by talking to the policymakers at the beginning, and also sharing the results with policymakers in a format that's accessible to them.
Okay, so I think that's really good. I just add to that from an industry perspective here. So obviously the policymakers are often responding to the needs of the country or the needs of their industry. In the UK, often we have fundamental research projects. Gcrf does cross into that because it does look at translation, or sort of on the journey towards translation. I think in the UK, we very much define that where you are looking at commercialization, or let's say you're developing a product, some sort of, I mean, here's one that Nicola's been speaking about, is a product here after your GCR. So clearly in the UK, we have what we call Innovate UK projects, where the funding model is a bit different. And there we have a bigger involvement in industry in terms of deciding where the calls are, and also co-funded by industry. So they have some actual investment, whilst they also get some investment, which is currently going to go to the researchers in these sorts of projects. So there are clear sort of technology readiness levels. And if you want to look at TRLs or technology levels, look into that. But clearly we define where translation exists. And I don't think that Gcrf necessarily is always designed to actually deliver a commercial company or a spin. I mean, it's quite difficult to do it's impossible in a time limited project. This is where that is possible, a sort of embryonic spin out. But I think we should see that there's further investment required often to take. That's something that Pakistan is. That's something that Pakistan is obviously thinking about how they. Okay.
All right, excellent. There's another question. What happens after the research ends, after the grant finishes? Does Gcrf require some kind of a handover to happen to relevant stakeholders in the country or community? What are the salient points, Nicola, if you could share for the audience? How does it work?
So the question is, does Gcrf require a handover to ensure? I spoke in my presentation about leaving a lasting legacy. The short answer to your question is that no, Gcrf does not require that formal evidence of handover. What Gcrf does require is a report, an annual report of the progress that the research is having against the objectives and what the outcomes are in terms of the academic and other kinds of dissemination and publications. But they are, in my experience, surprisingly hands-off when it comes to the reporting process. And certainly at the end of the project, evidence of some kind of a handover is not required. However, it is hoped that because of the nature of the research, because it is challenge focused, it's around equitable partnerships, it's almost expected that those relationships and that capacity building will be lasting, and that those relationships will continue into the future. At the moment, we're beginning, I mean, the Gcrf program has only been going for 5 years, so that opportunity for leaving a lasting legacy, we're still very early days for that, because many of the projects are still ongoing. But we are beginning to think about Gcrf2, which should be the next 5-year program of research funded through this stream. We're beginning to think about it. There are a number of conversations going on about what Gcrf2 might look like, and we're waiting for the government spending review before we can make any announcements or make anything public. But we are beginning to think about it, and we're beginning to think about how we can build on the projects that we have supported, and how we can ensure that there is some continuity, where that continuity might lead to greater legacy or greater impact. So that's something that we are thinking about. But yeah, the short answer to your question is there's no formal requirement for that handover to be evident, but we hope that that happens anyway as part and parcel of the way the project is set up from the beginning.
Lovely. Now, so we are ending our list of questions, and I think we're also ending our time for today's session. But I'd like to sort of ask one last question, perhaps from both Nicola, you and Professor Jawwad. Within this project that HEC is carrying out for World Bank, where we have a list of instruments, and Gcrf is one of the instruments that has now launched. We also have a local challenge fund, and we also have a technology transfer fund and an innovator seed fund. And ultimately, the objective is that whatever research is happening, it should not remain in the labs. It should reach the markets, and different instruments will help the process of taking that research to its logical conclusion. Yeah. And naturally, we don't expect spin-off companies to come out of this first instrument. The first instrument objective is to take the research to a certain point, and the second instrument then will take that output from the first instrument to the next stage, and so on and so forth. But at this particular stage, all the researchers who are putting together multidisciplinary teams, these are big projects, and there are multiple teams and multiple universities, and there's some knowledge creation, intellectual property creation, that ultimately will lead to creation of an intellectual asset that then could perhaps be commercialized, earning some revenue for all the stakeholders involved. Now, what are the key suggestions and pointers that you would give out to the researcher community at this stage? How they should plan the development, and also the sharing of the rewards of any commercial activity that comes out of this activity that's happening at this particular stage, because it's too early for them to know what will happen 2-3 phases down the road. But if a group of people are coming and creating intellectual asset right now, how they should what issues they should keep in mind that could come ahead of time that they could plan for at this particular stage in their consortia. Yeah?
Nicola, would you mind if I take that first?
I think you can take that completely. It's completely outside of my expertise. Okay.
All right. Well, it's like my favorite question, especially when you're talking about rewards, because I like to moan a lot, clearly. So let me start by saying, and Nicola would probably agree, that when you're doing a Gcrf project, often you need to gather what I would call market information. That's what is the local situation on the ground. I mean, if it's biofortification of wheat, there are all sorts of issues around the cost of it, whether the farmers will buy it in. So this links to the later on translation part of it. So the data that you've got, like the size of the problem, how many people, what's the value of the market, all this, what I call market research, has to be gathered in phase 1 ideally, right? Because you're going to have some tech or something that you've developed. It might be a social thing, not necessarily a tech or intellectual property. Well, let's assume it was. If you don't understand how that tech and its implementation, what the commercial aspects and social aspects of that are, the implications, the barriers, So you almost need to, and the risk register is quite helpful in this, but also is something like a SWOT analysis to look at, how these issues, social, commercial, geographical. So that's why you need these social scientists and others on the team, and you think at the end of it, you to translate it to the next stage. If you are able to, which effectively is a sort of seed fund for commercialization, as far as I understand it. So I'm sure I'll just carry on to the next bit. One of the things that if you've got a project and some technology or some IP, I mean, this is what I teach academics and what we do. The worst thing academics is to talk about their research to investors. They are rubbish. So you have to invest, and you might as well invest it in the first phase, training your team how to pitch. It's a small thing. It's a half-day thing or a day thing. How to pitch it to know what about. What's crucial before you go commercialization is understanding the industry or other stakeholders' needs and wants, and that is part of your level of funding for the translation from what you've developed. And lastly is the rewards. I don't know if it's changed, but I know for the last 10 or 12 years, the one thing that's really bothered me is how if you develop IP in Pakistan, and I think it went to Senate recently, I heard, but you should be able to form spin-outs. The youth that we're talking about, Pakistan, let's face it, to keep the same level of youth employment that you have right now, you need to create 1 million jobs a year for the next 5 years just to maintain youth employment at current levels. Now, if you are not even allowing intellectual property from universities to be translated to form spin-outs, you are not letting people form spin-outs. Clearly, that is against all international norms that I know of. You instead do is you create where they can earn business and create. I mean, you've got a population of 220 million people and rising. By 2050, you're going to have 300 and huge market there. You need to get your young, dynamic researchers in universities, give them the business skills, and also let them spin out their companies. And it needs to happen. It should have happened years ago, and it is only just beginning to happen. So look, those are the key things that we need to do. We all know it needs to be done. Nothing is happening quick enough in my view. And of course, you need to give them training. This goes back to my slide about training. I, as an academic, have had a lot of business, and we need to do more of that in Pakistan with these young entrepreneurs. Just setting up ORICs and things like that isn't, or these sort of spin-out facilities isn't going to work unless they actually understand how to operate in that new ecosystem. I don't know, Nicola, if you want to come back, but look, I'm very optimistic, even though I sound a bit down about it. But I really think the future is bright if we give the power to particularly empower our women and particularly the youth as well. Nicola, over to you.
Yes, I don't have anything to add.
Very much for the questions.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nicola. Okay, brilliant.
Thank you, Professor Jawwad, for a fantastic response on this. At HEC, I don't think there's any restriction on universities to spin out or not spin out companies, and there's complete autonomy. But there is a fair bit of ambiguity at the university and researcher level on whatever work that happens within university, who shares the intellectual property and in what proportion, and what happens when things commercialize. So because of that ambiguity, our researcher community usually is not fully incentivized or motivated to go down in the commercialization pathway. And this is exactly what we're trying to change under this program. Hopefully, some of the efforts that we are doing under Technology Transfer Fund will put the wheels in motion for a brighter future for Pakistan. On that note, I thank our presenters and the entire team that's been supporting these workshops, including Anila and Aman and Dr. Athar Osama. And if there are any further questions, Nicola, Professor Jawwad, if you allow us, we will then pass on the questions to you from our researcher community. Thank you so much again for your time.
Thank you.